This is the second video for slide set number 2 on chapter 17, Investigative and Data-Driven Journalism. And this is going to start the section on sources. I'm only going to cover human sources in this video, and we'll go over written sources and then wrap things up in the next video. So your sources are going to be what you need to kind of access in order to piece together all of the bits of information. And you're going to need to access lots of different kinds of sources, and you're probably going to need to go back to some sources, and sources will lead you on to different sources. You're creating a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, and there's lots of different variables and things up in the air. And we would love to tell you that you're going to get sources that are going to just gift wrap everything to you and give you everything you need to know in one bundle, but that's very rarely going to happen. So usually you're going to have to take a little bit of one source, add it to a little bit from a second source, shake it together with a piece of information that you've gotten from the web, and then put a cherry on top with going and talking to an expert to make sure that you've read everything perfectly. That's more likely to be what you're going to have to do in order to make a sundae that is your investigative journalism. This is a terrible metaphor, and I apologize. So you're going to need both human and written sources, and both of these are going to come in multiple flavors. But one of the things to keep in mind is that you're going to make a list of the people and the things that you're going to want to reference and who you're going to want to talk to and you're going to want to get a hold of. But not everybody's going to want to talk to you. And not all data that you want is going to be readily available. Also, even if you get a hold of things, there are times that documents are confusing and they'll lead you down the wrong path. Either just the way that it's written is really arcane and that it's in I think that accountants are probably wizards. Or they're doing it on purpose, that someone is trying to hide something. Because again, if you're doing investigative journalism, a lot of times you're trying to uncover something that someone has purposefully obscured. So remember that you need to be very careful with sources, both human and written, as we go through these things, and that very few people that you are going to encounter aren't going to be trying to kind of serve themselves in some way, and very few pieces of information that you encounter are going to be written from a totally neutral standpoint. And those that are the more likely to be the driest and hardest to comprehend. So just to keep that in mind. So in terms of how do you start when you're trying to figure out who you want to contact for human sources? So there are going to be people who are obviously connected to the story, and then there are going to be connections you need to draw and connections you need to pull in from outside. So some of the kind of obvious ones are going to be if there is a human at the center of your story, and who are their friends and enemies. If it is a, organization, again, they're still going to have friends and enemies. So again, remember that if you're trying to find out something that might look bad for somebody, their enemies are going to be the first ones to be like, oh yeah, you're totally right, and to help you. Again, though, they have a vested interest. They want to bring the person or entity down. So you always need to verify things. Now, friends are really interesting because they can be revealing in a way that enemies aren't. So even though they're trying to put the person or group or entity in a good light, sometimes there's stuff that they can reveal without realizing that they're revealing something. And they might actually be able to give you information that you didn't know before. If nothing else, you're trying to be objective. You're trying to see all sides of the story. Maybe there's mitigating circumstances, and even if you don't think that they're, enough to mitigate what happened, if you can be, if you can show that you can acknowledge these aspects of things, then people are going to believe what you have to say a lot more. So make sure that you kind of are aware of kind of both sides of the coin, that you're showing both sides of the coin, but also make sure that, you read into things that people say. Someone who is a friend to somebody might say something that they think is very blasé and that doesn't lead you anywhere, but in fact, to you, it's very telling. Similarly, are there winners and losers? If there's losers, again, they could often carry a grudge, so make sure that while they're good sources for you, make sure that you verify everything that they tell you. Similarly, victims. Again, if it's something like the example in your book is a school system, talk to students and parents. They have been victimized by the system, the person, the group that you are trying to get information on. Again, They can give you information that you do need to verify, but at times there's a few things that they can be useful for. One, you want to show the human side of things. People sometimes, corruption in large institutions is something that sadly we often take for granted, and people say, well, there's nothing I can do, so who cares? If you can put a face on things, if you can make people understand how this is impacting real people's lives, they care a lot more, and they're more willing to do something to help. The other thing with, getting victims and getting them to talk to you is that, you can get specific examples and you can get anecdotes. Again, when you're trying to tell the story at the end, when you're trying to get people to get engaged, then, your storytelling skills come out. Ira Glass is a great one. He is kind of famous for NPR's This American Life. And he talks about storytelling, and he talks about the fact that anecdotes are a wonderful way to tell a story because you can kind of sum up your point, but through something that's really engaging and that people hook onto. And again, they'll give you specific examples where if you're trying to talk about corruption in a large agency, well, that can seem huge and overwhelming, but if you can break it down to specific ways that things have impacted people, it makes it a lot more accessible. And again, make sure that you confirm every allegation that someone who kind of comes off on the fuzzy end of the lollipop makes, because remember that they have a point of view and that they've got a vested interest in you telling the story, which is terrific, and they'll make a great source, but they also have a vested interest in the outcome of the story. Experts can be really useful, especially once you've kind of gone through the first phase of data collection. So you've talked to people, and maybe you've talked to people inside an organization and they've told you information, but you don't really know what it means. Or you've combed through all these records and all this data, but you don't have context for it. So experts can clarify what you have. They can give you kind of background information. They're great for background. Now, sometimes they might not want to comment on the specifics of the case that you're looking at, especially if it's someone like a lawyer or a doctor. But a lot of times you can come up with a hypothetical situation that uses the facts that you have that they feel comfortable commenting on, especially if you want them to comment on the record. They'll often not comment on a specific case or a specific instance on the record. Now, the more you can get on the record, the more people will believe what you have to say, so the better your source is. So again, if you can find a way to make a hypothetical situation that they're comfortable commenting on the record, then the better for you. Police can be a good source, both in terms of human contacts and in terms of written contacts, because you can get sometimes access to police records. We'll go over that in a minute. But remember that, again, they've got a side of things. So sometimes they'll want to work with you because perhaps they know they can't prove something in a court of law, but they want the information to get out and for people to understand what happened. But there are times that they have ongoing investigations and they don't want information to get out because they feel like it could hurt their chances in court. So just kind of, again, be careful about that. So, kind of, again, you've got to use things with care. And again, with using things with care, people who are in trouble, they are, they're the same type of people that the police are going to be trying to help as well, hopefully. But again, you're coming at it from a different angle. So make sure that, you kind of think about how, in a way, you're using these people, but they're also going to want to use you. So again, this kind of comes back to some of the stuff that we talked about with beat reporting, where you want to cultivate context, but you want to cultivate them with care. Which kind of brings me to my next point, cultivating sources and cultivating them with care. You're going to want to work with the same kind of principles we talked about with beat reporting, and you can go review those if you want. But you need to remember that in this case, you need to be quicker. While you are going to work on this story for potentially a long period of time, you can't usually spend that much time with an individual source. If they're a really important source, they're key to the investigation, like Deep Throat was for Watergate, or I'm sure that some of the sources in Catch and Kill were for Rowan Farrow, then you might be able to spend that much time cultivating them. But for the most part, you won't have that opportunity. So you need to make sure that you can use those self-interests of those sources and not get used. So you can play to their self-interest and you can be fully aware of how they want the story to come out, as long as you're always conscious of the fact that they are invested in it as well. The other thing that you can use for cultivating sources, and you just need to be sure that you are super careful about this and that you, in fact, do protect them, is that you can offer confidentiality. Now, again, this can impact how much people believe the sources that you have. It was an issue with Deep Throat at the beginning. If you ever watched the movie All the President's Men, you'll see that, they were kind of embarrassed at first because of the information that they were given from their source, but, they were eventually able to get good information out of him, and it led them to be able to blow the case wide open. But Deep Throat's a really good example in that his identity was never revealed by the two reporters who were involved in the investigation. In fact, eventually his identity was revealed by his family when he was close to dying. He had dementia, and he was a key figure in the FBI at the time. And he had actually gone on record saying that he wasn't Deep Throat, but basically his family wanted him to receive some credit while he was still alive. And so while he was kind of at this point in his life, they decided to make it clear. And so people reached out to the two journalists who wrote the book, both All President's Men and Broke the Watergate Scandal, and they confirmed that he was in fact Deep Throat, but it was on basically his family's wishes that this was done, rather than they they didn't reveal it. And in fact, journalists have gone to jail for keeping their confidential sources a secret. And generally, it is considered to be better to go to jail and to protect your sources than to reveal a source to anyone. Don't even reveal sources to friends or colleagues. You really need to be careful about this, because while you might have integrity, someone else might not. And they might have reason to try to undermine your source. So this kind of goes back to what we were saying about using a code. If you're using someone who's confidential, see Deep Throat. And again, this was something, this came up with Valerie Plame, which might be more in kind of our lifetimes, where there was, it was exposed that she had been a CIA operative undercover, and the person who reported on this did not want to give up her White House contact, who ended up, I believe, being Karl Rove. And eventually he basically said, "It was me," in order to have her avoid further jail time. So usually, this is the other reason why lawyers get involved kind of from the beginning, is that oftentimes the people who pay you, who are your bosses, will cover, the costs of your legal fees, and, will pay you while you're in jail, etc. So that's things to remember when you're cultivating your human sources. But just make sure that you take care with them. Part of the problem is that humans are, in fact, human. They may lie. They have a vested interest. Remember, they might tell you something that they want you to think. Even if they are a source that's, if they're a source that's friendly to the person you're investigating, they're going to lie to cover their friend. They might forget. They might tell you one thing one day and something another day because they've forgotten. They could change their story for kind of both good and bad reasons. And also remember that if someone doesn't want to be identified, they don't want to go on the record, that impacts the credibility of the story that you're writing.